The morning sun beat down on Officer Robert Wilson's patrol car as he cruised through the peaceful streets of Pine Grove, an upscale neighborhood where trouble rarely showed its face. He'd been on duty for nearly 16 hours straight, his uniform collar damp with sweat, and his eyes burning from lack of sleep. His young daughter had been sick all night, and between her fever and his double shift, he hadn't caught more than 20 minutes of rest at a time. The call came in around 9:30 a.m. A minor traffic dispute at the corner of Oakwood and Pine. Nothing serious, just the kind of thing that usually resolved itself with a few calm words and some paperwork. But today it wasn't usual. Today, everything felt like it was pushing against Officer Wilson's last nerve. As he pulled up to the scene, he saw two cars, a silver BMW and a white SUV, parked awkwardly near the intersection. A small group of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk, phones already out and recording. Wilson noticed their presence but was too tired to care. His mind kept drifting to his daughter's fever, the stack of bills on his kitchen table, and the letter from his late wife's medical debt collectors that he couldn't bring himself to open. The BMW's owner stood beside his car, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit that probably cost more than Wilson made in a month. He was a tall black man with gray peppered through his short hair, radiating the kind of confidence that came from years of success. The SUV driver, a middle-aged woman, was gesturing animatedly as she tried to explain her side of the story. Wilson stepped out of his patrol car, his movements heavy with exhaustion. He didn't bother with the usual friendly approach he might have used on a better day. Instead, he barked out, "Everyone back to your vehicles. Now." The man in the suit turned, his expression showing surprise at the aggressive tone. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. We were just discussing." "Sir, I said back to your vehicle." Wilson cut him off, his voice rising. The lack of sleep, the worry about his daughter, the endless pressure of life as a single dad. It all bubbled up inside him like a shaken soda can ready to burst. The man stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, I'm simply trying to explain the situation. There's no need for." What happened next took less than 2 seconds, but it would change both their lives forever. Wilson's hand moved before his brain could stop it. A quick, sharp movement that ended with his palm connecting with the man's face. The slap echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze. The onlookers gasped. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." The woman by the SUV covered her mouth with her hands. And Wilson, suddenly wide awake, stared in horror at what he'd just done. The man touched his cheek slowly, his eyes locked on Wilson's. Then, with devastating calmness, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Officer Wilson," he said, opening the leather fold to reveal a federal judge's credentials, "I'm Judge Anthony Richardson, and I believe we both just had a moment we're going to need to discuss." Wilson's stomach dropped to his feet. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear phones clicking, cars passing, and his own career shattering into a million pieces. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this terrible moment would become the beginning of something nobody could have predicted. Over at the station, Wilson's sergeant would soon be getting the first of many calls. News vans would be heading their way. Social media would be lighting up with video clips. But right there, in that moment, it was just two men standing on a street corner, both realizing that their lives had just changed forever. By noon, the video had spread like wildfire. People watched it over breakfast, during lunch breaks, and in office cubicles. Each share, each retweet added fuel to a fire that was quickly becoming too big to contain. The calm street corner where it all happened was now crowded with news vans, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Officer Wilson sat alone in a small conference room at the police station, his badge and gun already surrendered. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from fellow officers, old friends, even his elderly mother who'd seen it on the local news. But the only message he could think about was the one from his neighbor watching his daughter. She's asking for you. When are you coming home? Down at the federal courthouse, Judge Richardson was dealing with his own storm. His colleagues kept stopping by his chambers, their faces a mix of concern and barely contained anger. You need to press charges, urged one. This is bigger than just you, insisted another. His secretary had already fielded calls from 3 national news networks and the governor's office. The judge stood at his office window, absently rubbing his cheek where the slap had landed. 20 years on the bench, and he'd never seen anything quite like this. He watched as protesters began gathering outside the courthouse, their signs demanding justice, their voices rising above the usual downtown noise. Back at the station, Chief Thompson called an emergency press conference. Under the harsh glare of camera lights, he spoke about immediate suspension, thorough investigation, and zero tolerance for excessive force. But his words seemed to float away in the wind of public outrage that was building by the hour. Social media exploded with opinions. Some defended Wilson, pointing to his clean record and the pressures officers face. Others saw it as yet another example of police brutality, demanding immediate firing and criminal charges. Everyone had something to say, but few knew the whole story. By late afternoon, Wilson finally made it home. His daughter ran to him, still warm with fever but smiling. As he held her, his phone pinged with a message from his union representative. Don't talk to anyone. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. He looked at his little girl, wondering how to explain that Daddy might not be a police officer anymore. Meanwhile, Judge Richardson sat in his study at home, reviewing the day's events. His wife brought him tea, her hands shaking slightly as she set down the cup. What are you going to do? She asked softly. The judge didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about something he'd seen in Wilson's eyes right after the slap. Not anger, but fear and desperation. The city held its breath that evening. On local news, experts debated the legal implications. Community leaders called for calm while demanding accountability. Police officers watched the footage in break rooms, many seeing themselves in Wilson's shoes, wondering if they too were one bad moment away from disaster. Late that night, as the city finally began to quiet, 2 men lay awake in their beds, miles apart, but connected by a single moment of human weakness. Officer Wilson stared at his ceiling, listening to his daughter's peaceful breathing from the next room, wondering if he'd ever wear his badge again. Judge Richardson sat in his home office, looking at old case files, particularly those involving good people who'd made terrible mistakes. Neither man knew it yet, but tomorrow would bring something unexpected. While everyone else was choosing sides and demanding justice, the judge was forming a different plan. Sometimes, he believed, the path to real justice wasn't straight or simple. Sometimes it required looking beyond the surface of things, beyond the viral videos and angry headlines, to see the human beings caught in the storm. The meeting room felt smaller than usual that morning. Officer Wilson sat beside his union representative, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of cold coffee. Across the table, Judge Richardson's presence seemed to fill the space, though he sat just as quietly. Their lawyers exchanged cautious glances, wondering why the judge had requested this private meeting before pressing charges. Outside, reporters camped on the courthouse steps didn't know this meeting was happening. They were still running the same footage on loop, the slap, the shock, the aftermath. But inside this room, something different was unfolding. Officer Wilson, the judge spoke first, his voice steady and calm. Tell me about your daughter. The question caught everyone off guard. Wilson's lawyer started to object, but the judge raised his hand gently. This isn't an interrogation. I just want to talk. Wilson swallowed hard, his throat tight. She's 8, he said softly. She's been sick lately. That morning, he paused, fighting back emotions he couldn't afford to show. She had a fever of 103. The judge nodded, leaning forward slightly. And her mother? The question hung in the air like heavy smoke. Wilson's union rep shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Cancer, Wilson managed to say. 2 years ago. The bills. He stopped again, his hands tightening around the coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. Judge Richardson stood up suddenly, surprising everyone. He walked to the window, looking out at the city below. 25 years ago, he began, still facing the window. I was a young lawyer. Late one night, I got pulled over. The officer was having a bad day. Things escalated. Words were exchanged. He turned back to face Wilson. I know what it's like to be on the other side of anger. The tension in the room shifted. The lawyers looked at each other, unsure where this was heading. Wilson stared at his coffee cup, unable to meet the judge's eyes. What happened that morning, the judge continued, returning to his seat, was wrong. We both know that. But I've spent my career watching people get lost in a system that knows how to punish, but often forgets how to heal. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. I have a different proposal. Instead of pressing charges, I want to try something else. He opened the folder, revealing a detailed program outline. 6 months of community service working with youth in struggling neighborhoods. Regular counseling sessions. And you'll help develop a new training program for the department, focusing on stress management and cultural understanding. Wilson's lawyer leaned forward, scanning the documents with narrowed eyes. Your Honor, are you saying you're not pressing charges? I'm saying I believe in second chances, the judge replied, his eyes fixed on Wilson. But they have to be earned. This isn't an easy way out. It's actually harder than facing traditional punishment. You'll have to confront things about yourself that won't be comfortable. For the first time since sitting down, Wilson looked directly at the judge. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. An understanding that went beyond words. Wilson thought about his daughter, about the kind of father he wanted to be for her. He thought about that morning, about how quickly anger had destroyed everything he'd worked for. Why? Wilson asked simply. Why would you do this? The judge smiled slightly, touching his cheek where the slap had landed. Because 30 years ago, someone gave me a second chance, and it changed my life. He pushed the folder across the table. Sometimes justice wears a different face than people expect. The lawyers began discussing details, their voices a distant hum in Wilson's ears. He stared at the folder in front of him, seeing not just a way out of trouble, but a path to becoming someone better. Outside, the world was still demanding punishment, still sharing angry posts and heated opinions. But in this room, something extraordinary was happening. A moment of grace that would ripple out far beyond these walls. The old photographs spread across Wilson's kitchen table told a story few people knew. His daughter sat beside him, carefully touching the edges of a picture showing her father in military uniform. Daddy, why do you look so serious here? She asked, her innocent question bringing back a flood of memories. Wilson picked up the photo, remembering the scorching heat of Afghanistan, the weight of his gear, and the friends he'd lost. Sometimes, he explained gently, grown-ups have to be serious to protect others. He didn't tell her about the nightmares that still woke him up, the sound of explosions that sometimes seemed to hide in everyday noises like car doors slamming. In another photo, his late wife smiled at the camera, healthy and vibrant, before cancer rewrote their story. His daughter touched her mother's face in the picture. I remember when Mom made chocolate chip pancakes, she said softly. Wilson hugged her close, thinking about the stack of medical bills in his desk drawer, each one a reminder of their last desperate months fighting a battle they couldn't win. Across town, Judge Richardson sat in his home office, looking through his own collection of memories. His wife brought him tea, just like she had every evening for 30 years. You're doing the right thing, she said, noticing the old newspaper clipping on his desk. It was yellowed with age, showing a young Richardson at his law school graduation. Not everyone thinks so, he replied, picking up his phone to show her the latest messages from colleagues questioning his decision not to press charges. They don't understand why I'm choosing this path. His wife sat down beside him, pointing to another photo on his desk. It showed a younger Richardson standing with an older white judge, both smiling. "Tell me about him again," she said, though she knew the story by heart. Richardson touched the frame gently. "I was so angry back then," he began. "Fresh out of law school, ready to fight every injustice I saw. Then I got into that confrontation with the police officer." He paused, remembering. "Judge Thompson could have ended my career before it began. Instead, he saw something in me worth saving." Back at Wilson's house, his daughter had fallen asleep on the couch. He covered her with a blanket, thinking about how quickly things could change. 2 weeks ago, he was a respected officer with a spotless record. Now, his colleagues barely made eye contact when he came to the station to sign paperwork. He picked up another photo, this one showing him at his police academy graduation. His wife had been so proud that day, beaming as she pinned on his badge. He joined the force wanting to protect people, to serve his community. Somewhere along the way, between the PTSD from his military service and the grief of losing his wife, that sense of purpose had gotten buried under layers of exhaustion and stress. Meanwhile, Judge Richardson was making his own preparations. He'd spent the evening calling community leaders, explaining his vision for Wilson's rehabilitation program. Some were skeptical, others cautiously supportive. "It's not about excusing what happened," he told them. "It's about transforming it into something meaningful." As night fell over the city, both men found themselves thinking about second chances. Wilson sat in his daughter's room, watching her sleep, wondering if he could become the father and officer she could be proud of again. Judge Richardson stood in his backyard, looking at the stars, remembering his own journey from an angry young man to someone who could see beyond the surface of things. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be paperwork to file, programs to arrange, and plenty of people ready to criticize every decision. But tonight, in the quiet moments, two men who'd collided in a moment of chaos were finding their way towards something neither had expected: a chance to turn a mistake into a mission. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation that morning. Reporters packed the hallways, their cameras ready to capture what everyone expected to be a standard hearing for criminal charges. Instead, they were about to witness something none of them had anticipated. Judge Richardson adjusted his robes one final time before entering the courtroom. His clerk caught his arm gently. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "The press is going to have a field day." The judge simply nodded, his mind already made up. The courtroom fell silent as he took his place at the bench. Officer Wilson sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller in his civilian clothes than he had in his uniform. His daughter wasn't present. He'd arranged for his mother to watch her, wanting to shield her from whatever was about to happen. "Before we begin," Judge Richardson's voice filled the room, "I want to address something." He removed his reading glasses, looking directly at the gathered crowd. "Everyone here expects justice today. The question is, what does justice look like?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised. The judge continued, "We live in a world quick to punish, slow to understand. We demand justice, but often confuse it with revenge. Today, we're going to try something different." He held up a thick document. "I have here a proposal for restorative justice. Instead of pressing criminal charges, I am advocating for a comprehensive rehabilitation program." The murmur grew louder. A reporter in the back stood up, but the judge raised his hand for silence. "Officer Wilson will undergo 6 months of intensive community service working directly with youth programs in neighborhoods that have historically distrusted law enforcement. He will receive counseling for his PTSD from military service. Most importantly, he will help develop new training protocols for the police department, focusing on stress management and cultural sensitivity." The district attorney rose to object, but Judge Richardson wasn't finished. "I know many of you think I've lost my mind," he said, a slight smile crossing his face. "You're wondering why a black judge who was publicly slapped by a white officer would choose this path." He paused, looking around the courtroom. 25 years ago, I was an angry young lawyer who got into an altercation with a police officer. Another judge saw something in me worth saving. He gave me a choice: press charges and seek punishment, or work to change the system from within. I chose the latter, and it led me to this bench. Wilson looked up for the first time, his eyes meeting the judge's. The room was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Officer Wilson made a terrible mistake, the judge continued. But that mistake doesn't have to be the end of his story. It can be the beginning of something new, something better. He turned to address Wilson directly. This won't be easy. You'll face skepticism, criticism, and plenty of people who think you're getting off too lightly. The real punishment isn't a fine or jail time. It's doing the hard work of confronting your own biases, healing your own trauma, and helping others do the same. The judge held up another document. I have here letters from 12 community organizations willing to work with you. They're not offering forgiveness. That has to be earned. They're offering an opportunity to turn this moment into a movement for real change. Looking back at the crowd, Judge Richardson's voice grew stronger. Some will call this soft justice. I call it smart justice. We can't arrest our way out of systemic problems. We can't punish our way to peace. Sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is choose understanding over anger, growth over retribution. He picked up his gavel, pausing for a moment. The easy path would be to follow the usual script: charges, pleas, sentences. But today, we're choosing the harder path, the path that might actually lead to change. The sound of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom. What happened next would make headlines across the country, but not for the reasons anyone had expected when they walked in that morning. The community center's basketball court wasn't much to look at, with its faded lines and slightly bent rim, but to the kids playing there, it was everything. Officer Wilson stood at the sidelines, watching a pickup game while trying to ignore the suspicious glances from parents nearby. It was his first day of community service, and he felt as out of place as a penguin in a desert. They're not going to bite. A deep voice stood behind him. The center's director, a tall man with kind eyes, handed Wilson a whistle. But they're not going to trust you right away either. That's something you'll have to earn. Wilson nodded, taking the whistle with slightly shaking hands. His therapist had warned him about this: the anxiety, the fear of judgment. Start with what you know, she'd said during their first session. So here he was, about to coach youth basketball, something he loved before life got complicated. Hey kids, the director called out. Coach Wilson's here to start our new basketball program. The game stopped. 12 faces turned to look at him, some curious, others skeptical. One boy in the back whispered something to his friend, and they both laughed. Taking a deep breath, Wilson stepped forward. Who wants to learn how to do a proper layup? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. A few hands went up hesitantly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over at the police academy, Judge Richardson was giving a presentation about the new training program they were developing. Stress management isn't just about deep breathing, he explained to a room full of instructors. It's about understanding what triggers us, what pushes us past our limits. He played the video of Wilson slapping him, not to shame, but to teach. Look at the body language, the signs of stress. Where could this situation have been de-escalated? The room was quiet, officers taking notes, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Back at the community center, Wilson was demonstrating a defensive stance when one of the kids, a quiet boy who'd been watching from the corner, finally spoke up. My brother got arrested last year, he said suddenly. The court fell silent. The officer was mean to him. Are you mean like that? Wilson felt his throat tighten. The old him might have gotten defensive, might have explained away police behavior. Instead, he remembered what his therapist had taught him about honesty. I used to think being tough meant being right, he said slowly, but I was wrong. I'm here because I'm learning to be better, just like you're learning basketball. The boy studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Your form is wrong on your jump shot," he said with a small smile. The tension broke, and other kids started offering their own basketball critiques, laughing. At the end of the day, Wilson sat in his car, emotionally exhausted, but feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. His phone buzzed with a text from Judge Richardson. How was day one? He typed back, "Hard. Good. These kids," he paused, then added, "they remind me why I wanted to be a cop in the first place." The judge's response came quickly. "That's the point. See you at group therapy tomorrow." Wilson drove home, thinking about the day. His daughter would want to hear all about it. She always did. She'd been proud when he told her he was going to help kids learn basketball. Prouder still when he explained he was working to become a better person. Pulling into his driveway, he noticed his hands weren't shaking anymore. The whistle the director had given him hung around his neck, a simple piece of plastic that somehow felt heavier than his old badge. Tomorrow would bring more challenges: group therapy with other officers, more suspicious looks, more difficult conversations. But for the first time since that morning on the street corner, Wilson felt like he was moving forward instead of just falling down. The path ahead was long, but at least now he could see where it might lead. 3 months had passed since that first day at the community center, and things were changing in ways nobody had expected. The local news station Van parked outside wasn't there to cover another scandal. They were filming a story about the new youth basketball league that had grown from Wilson's community service program. Inside the center, the court was packed. Parents who once watched Wilson suspiciously from the sidelines now sat in the bleachers, cheering as their kids played. The quiet boy who'd asked about his arrested brother was now team captain, wearing his jersey with pride. "Look at how his footwork has improved," Wilson said to Judge Richardson, who'd come to watch the game. They stood at the back of the gym, watching the kids play. The judge nodded, but he wasn't just watching the basketball. He was watching the bigger picture unfold. A group of police cadets sat mixed in with the crowd, part of their new training program. Instead of learning about the community from behind a desk, they were here, seeing firsthand how bridges could be built. Some even volunteered as assistant coaches. "Chief wants to implement this program citywide," Wilson mentioned, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "Says our juvenile crime rates are down 15% in this neighborhood since we started." The judge smiled. Sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones. Kids needed a safe space and positive role models. Officers needed to see the community as people, not problems. A timeout was called, and Wilson's daughter ran over from where she'd been keeping score. She'd become the team's unofficial mascot, loved by all the players. "Dad," she called out, "Coach Thomas says we're going to win the championship." Her eyes sparkled with excitement. Wilson hugged her, remembering how different things had been just a few months ago. His therapy sessions had helped him understand his PTSD triggers better. The group sessions with other officers had shown him he wasn't alone in his struggles. But it was these kids who had truly helped him heal. The local newspaper reporter, who'd written that first angry article about the slapping incident, sat in the corner working on a very different story now. From conflict to connection, read her notebook heading. She'd been following the program's progress, documenting how a moment of violence had transformed into a movement of change. During halftime, an older man approached Wilson. "You're the officer from the video, right?" Wilson tensed slightly, but nodded. The man continued, "My grandson's on the team. He wants to be a police officer now. Says he wants to be like Coach Wilson." Wilson felt his throat tighten. The judge, overhearing, placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. This was the real measure of change, not in statistics or news stories, but in changed hearts and minds. After the game, parents and kids gathered for a community dinner in the center's cafeteria. Officers and residents sat together, sharing meals and stories. The walls that had seemed so high 3 months ago were slowly coming down. One of the mothers, who'd initially protested Wilson's presence at the center, now helped organize these dinners. My son used to run when he saw a police car, she told a group of cadets. Now he waves. That's what real change looks like. As the evening wound down, Wilson found himself looking at old photos on his phone. That terrible morning, his first day at the center, and now this. Each image told part of a story that was bigger than him, bigger than any single person. Judge Richardson gathered everyone's attention for a brief announcement about expanding the program to other neighborhoods. As he spoke, Wilson watched the faces in the crowd. Officers, parents, kids, community leaders, all nodding in agreement. They weren't just audience members anymore. They were part of something transformative. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in peaceful colors. The news van was packing up, but the real story wasn't in their footage. It was in the small moments. A fist bump between a cadet and a teenager, a shared laugh over dinner, a child's dream of becoming an officer who serves rather than intimidates. 3 years had passed since that life-changing morning. The conference hall was packed with police chiefs, community leaders, and journalists from across the country. On stage, Officer Wilson adjusted his newly pressed uniform, the badge gleaming under the lights. Beside him, Judge Richardson prepared his notes for their joint presentation. "Ready?" the judge asked quietly. Wilson looked out at the crowd, then at his daughter sitting in the front row, now 11 and beaming with pride. "Ready," he replied. The presentation screen showed a familiar image, the viral video that had started it all. But now, instead of causing anger, it served as a powerful teaching tool. The judge began, "What you're about to hear is not just our story. It's a blueprint for change." Wilson stepped forward, his voice steady. 3 years ago, I was a broken man who made a terrible mistake. Today, I lead our department's community relations unit. But more importantly, I'm a better father, a better officer, and a better human being. He clicked to the next slide, showing pictures of the youth basketball program that had grown into a citywide initiative. We've expanded from one community center to 12. Crime rates have dropped by 30% in participating neighborhoods, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. The screen showed a recent graduation ceremony. The quiet boy who'd once questioned Wilson about his arrested brother was now receiving a scholarship to college. His dream? To study criminal justice and bridge the gap between police and communities. Judge Richardson took over, explaining how their program had been adopted by police departments in 5 other cities. It's not just about preventing incidents like ours, he explained. It's about transforming how we think about justice, community, and healing. They shared stories of change. Officers who'd learned to recognize their stress triggers, communities that had gone from hostile to collaborative, young people who now saw police as mentors rather than threats. Each success had started small, just like their basketball program. Wilson's daughter stood up to share her part. "My dad always says that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I've watched him become someone new, someone stronger." The presentation ended with a recent photo of a community dinner at the original center. Officers and residents sat together, laughing and sharing stories. The walls that had once divided them were now tables that brought them together. During the queue in a session, a police chief from another state asked, "How do you respond to critics who say your approach is too soft?" Wilson and the judge exchanged a knowing look. The judge answered, "We've learned that true strength isn't in showing force, it's in showing understanding. Our officers are now better equipped to handle stress. Our communities are safer, and our children see a future where they can trust those who serve them." After the conference, Wilson walked through the park near his home. The same park where, 3 years ago, he couldn't even wear his uniform without getting suspicious looks. Now, kids waved as he passed, calling out, "Hey, coach." Parents smiled and nodded. His phone buzzed with a message from the judge. "Your story just got approved for the National Police Training Curriculum. It's official. What started with a slap will end up teaching thousands. Wilson sat on a bench, watching the sunset. His daughter was at basketball practice. She'd become quite the player herself. In his pocket was a letter from one of his first youth program kids, now studying to become a police officer. The judge's words from 3 years ago echoed in his mind. Sometimes justice wears a different face than people expect. Looking back, Wilson realized that face wasn't just about punishment or forgiveness. It was about transformation. As darkness fell, he walked home, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to bridge divides. But now he knew that every mistake, every moment of darkness, could become a doorway to something better. The story that began with a slap had become something none of them could have imagined. A testament to the power of choosing understanding over anger, growth over punishment, and hope over hate. And somewhere in the city, another officer was having a bad day, but now there was a path forward, a way to turn wrong into right.